Okay, chapter 37 covers communities and ecosystems, but we're going to just kind of leave it at communities today so we can keep moving forward. So an introduction to both of these sections is that many drugs are derived from plants. For example, morphine is a powerful pain reliever that comes from opium poppies. There's a chemical found in certain ephedra species that relieve symptoms of asthma. A drug from foxglove is used to treat congestive heart failure. Common plant stimulants include caffeine, which is found in coffee berries, tea leaves, and cola nuts, and then nicotine and tobacco leaves. So we're going to get some interactions between species is the whole idea here. Researchers are eagerly testing newly discovered compounds that show pharmaceutical promise, so against cancer and infectious diseases like malaria and HIV, pain relievers and sedatives, some possibilities to promote weight loss, and some other uses. So plant chemicals are kind of based on their interactions with other organisms. Why are they making these substances? What's the adaptive value? So in a community, populations of different species interact with one another, and some of these relationships are potentially harmful. So that's the important one to look at here. That's the whole point to all these kind of crazy plant chemicals. Okay. I don't think, those don't look like poppies to me, but there's a different chemical involved with those. Okay, so today, or at least this lecture, we're going to look at community structure and dynamics. We'll leave the ecosystem for a little bit later. So our essential question can be something like, what is community structure? And we could say, and maybe its dynamics, or how does it change? That's basically the idea about dynamics. So what is community structure? And how does it change? Okay. So in the hierarchy of life, that's the bit that we talked about before, that whole going all the way from biosphere to kind of atoms. A population is a group of interacting individuals of a particular species. That next step on the hierarchy is called a biological community. So it's an assemblage of all the populations of organisms living close enough together for potential interaction. So if we want an official definition, I don't know why it keeps doing that. Oops. Try to wipe the screen, that's a bad idea. But nonetheless, that's an actual official definition for community, assemblage of populations of organisms living close enough for potential interaction. Ecologists define the boundaries of a community according to the research questions they want to investigate. So again, it's kind of our defined geographic location. Community ecology, so that community part, is necessary for conservation of endangered species and the management of wildlife, game, and fisheries. It's vital for controlling diseases like malaria, bird flu, Lyme disease, things that are carried by animals, because there's an interaction between those species. It actually has application for agriculture, where people attempt to control species composition of communities they've established. So once we have a plant in place and then there are some interactions from the pest species in that, we then try to control those species interactions. So all of these are examples that use community ecology. Interspecific interactions. So the name gives you what we're talking about. Inter sort of means between two things. Intra is within, inter is between. But inter, between, and specific, we mean species. So these are between two species that we're having an interaction. So between species interactions. So these are relationships with individuals of other species in the community and greatly affect the population structure and dynamics. So we're going to look at a table to look at some of those things that we already know, because interspecific means that we could have competition, mutualism, predation, herbivory, and parasitism, or pathogens. So we'll elaborate on those, but these are actually things that you probably already know. There's a few other ones that are in there too, but it'll give us a good start. Okay, so interspecific competition occurs when populations of two different species compete for the same limited resource. This should be what we saw. I'm trying to even it out where are we at in my brain, but you should be doing, you should have done the two little paramecia before looking at this lecture, And so the two paramecia are examples of interspecific competition. Okay, so they're competing for the same limited petri dish resource. So that's a good example. In mutualism, both populations benefit. So everybody can think of lots of examples for this one. I'd want different ones, but you can always think of like sea anemone and clownfish. In predation, one species, the predator, kills and then eats the prey. So there's lots of examples of that as the, you know, what is it, predation? Like an eagle and something else, like a snake or something, which is predation. I can't always think of the easy ones. I don't know what's wrong with my brain. Herbivory is an animal consumes plant parts or algae. So herbivores, just any of those. I think turtles are basically that. Somebody in the reptiles is like, you don't know what you're talking about. But bug-world aphids, caterpillars, those are herbivores. In parasitism, the host plants or animals are victimized by parasites or pathogens. So parasitism is sort of like predation, but not the same. So one has to kind of host the other one. It has to have something living in it. All right, a different definition here is an ecological niche. I've also heard it niche. I think niche is fine. That's how I learned it originally, but niche is the technical term. I learned it from a professor who just emphasized the ish part, and it sounded very just ugh. So that's what always makes me laugh. But anyways, it's an ecological niche. That's technically how that one's said. So it's the sum of an organism's use of biotic and abiotic resources in its environment. So your niche is where you fit in and how you're able to use your biotic and abiotic resources. Interspecific competition occurs when two niches, or the niches of two populations, overlap. Both populations need a resource that's short in supply. So again, think about the two paramecia. What are their resources that they were limited on? Okay. In general, competition lowers the carrying capacity of competing populations because the resources used by one population are not available to the other population. So both of them have a lowered carrying capacity, which means that both of them will be negatively affected. All right, so these are two guys that maybe are all in each other's niches and are just, lower on their carrying capacity. Jerks. Just kidding. That's just the way it goes. That's nature. We're all competing for different resources. So reef-building corals and photosynthetic dinoflagellates, those are our protist guys, provide a good example of how mutualists benefit each other in a relationship. So if we have photosynthetic dinoflagellates, they gain shelter, secure shelter, and access to light. And then they produce sugars through photosynthesis. At least half of their energy is used by the coral animals. So they make sugars and then they give them to the coral animals. The use of the coral's waste products, including carbon dioxide and ammonia, is a valuable source of nitrogen for making proteins to the little dinoflagellates. So the coral and these dinoflagellates are hanging out together and providing each other with beneficial resources. So there's we'll see an enemy for you. Predation benefits the predator, and for those things we usually go kind of positives and negatives. So it's benefits the predator and not so much the prey. You could put a negative. You could look at other ways to represent that too. But prey adapt to using protective strategies that include camouflage, mechanical defenses, and chemical defenses. So that's where you sort of get these evolutionary connections of where you get sort of coevolution. Things are evolving together because they'll push each other. There was one, it's between, we'll have to look it up, you can remind me, but it's between like a frog and a snake, and the both of them are pushing each other to become more and more toxic because the frog doesn't want to get eaten by the snake, and the snake continues to eat the frog, so they just both become more and more toxic as a way to try to just continue to eat each other. So that would be some chemical defenses on that one. Alright, but we could have camouflage. There's your froggy. He doesn't want to be found. So he looks more like the bark. These guys are pretty toxic. Believe it or not, the monarch butterfly produces a toxin that is distasteful to birds. When they eat it, they essentially vomit. And so anything that sort of looks like it would be helpful, but it's yellow, or not yellow, but the orangish coloration is a warning to birds. Like, if you eat me, you will throw up. But that's a defense against predation. Okay, so at 10 minutes, it's a good place to take a break, pause, and then come back. So a plant whose body parts have been eaten by an animal must expend energy to replace that loss. So they're losing something in herbivory. So numerous defenses against herbivores have evolved in plants. Plant defenses against herbivores include spines and thorns. So you can think of thorns like roses, for example. There's also chemical toxins, often substances that we use medicinally or for other purposes. So the whole point of like nicotine in a tobacco plant is actually to be a deterrent. I want to say a lot of those things are, probably even the caffeine, but we know I just survive on that. There's coevolution between me and caffeine bush. Just kidding, the coffee plants, right? But like the chemical defenses in animals, toxins in plants tend to be distasteful, and herbivores learn to avoid them. If we know that a plant is poisonous, we don't mess with it. That works out. Some plants even produce chemicals that cause abnormal development in insects that eat them. They go that far on the evolutionary tree. I mean, think, if you're not moving, though, you gotta have some pretty insane defenses. So herbivores and plants undergo what's called, like I said, coevolution. It's a series of reciprocal, which just means kind of a give and take, back and forth, evolutionary adaptations in two species in which the change in one species acts as a new selective force for the other species. This is coevolution. I think we've talked about it. Co means together, so this is evolution that's happening together. Nice. Let me know if this part doesn't make sense, but it means they're providing a selective pressure against each other. And the resulting adaptations of the second species in turn then affect the selection of the individuals of this first species. So they push each other, like that frog and the snake that I was talking about. One gets more toxic than the other, gets more able to eat toxic things. And they just keep pushing each other. So figure 37.6 illustrates an example of coevolution between an herbivorous insect, like the caterpillar of Heliconius, and a plant. Okay, so this is like a caterpillar. It doesn't lay the eggs, but the parent does. This is, it's passion flower, if I do remember. It looks like an alien. But it actually produces, because they won't lay eggs, like the butterflies won't lay eggs in a place where they already think their eggs are, because you don't want to have competition and then have your babies die out, because maybe the other ones were a little bit stronger in that case. So if it looks like it has eggs on it, they won't land there and then lay the eggs. So these particular passion flowers have these sort of decoy-looking eggs that they produce to get the Heliconius butterflies to not land on them. Pretty cool stuff. So a parasite lives, and let me say that real quick when we go back on that one, is remember, this isn't like a conscious choice either. This is just things that have come up, and they seem to work because of these other selective pressures of butterflies. So remember, this isn't like a plant is then choosing to produce eggs. It's just because it looks like eggs, it worked, and so that had a selective advantage. Remember, all this stuff's passive. Although even I tend to give it wording like, oh, it developed these and it hasn't. Remember, it's still that passive selective process where these random mutations occurred and then it just worked. Okay, so just want to make that kind of disclaimer. All right, so a parasite lives on or in a host which it obtains nourishment. So internal parasites include nematodes and tapeworms. So tapeworms in a dog are definitely ones that you would find inside. Some external parasites include mosquitoes, ticks, and aphids. Those live on the outsides of things, but still, parasitize things. Pathogens are disease-causing microscopic parasites that include bacteria, viruses, fungi, and protists. Plants are also attacked by parasites, including nematodes and aphids. And the aphids will tap into their phloem and suck the plant sap, so that sugary kind of the water source that they're creating. Okay, so good to know pathogens and parasites if you're not sure on that one. Pathogens are the disease causers, and parasites are kind of the one that need a host for nourishment. Although I did not do a good job sort of defining those for you, you might want to make sure that if you haven't figured those out already, have a definition for yourself. Because I'll throw them out there without thinking about it. So if a parasite and a pathogen are not clear to you, make sure they're clear. All right, these are aphids, by the way, which on a plant, if you see too many of them at one time and you don't know, they do kind of, like, you look at a plant with these guys on there and you're like, oh my god, I'm itchy. It can do that. I imagine if the plant had those kind of feels, it might be itchy too, but if you look up one of these little guys up close, they are pretty cute. That's just my personal opinion. All right, so non-native pathogens can have rapid and dramatic impacts. This is huge. As an entomologist, as somebody who studies bugs, this is a big one for us. So the American chestnut was devastated by the chestnut blight protist, and that's a fungi-like pathogen that's currently causing sudden oak death on the west coast. Okay, so some pathogens like that, bugs will bring all kinds of pathogens. That's where some of these come from. This is interesting to me. Okay. So yeah, those are, like I said, those are of interest to looking at those things. You can even take it back to the historical context with kind of the potato blight. That's that kind of fungus. We've talked about some other ones. Those things have some significant impact. All right, here's the next thing. Stuff we already know, but we want to give it fancier terms. So if you need another break, now is a good time because we are switching gears here. So every community has what's called a trophic structure. And if we remember from autotroph or heterotroph, troph just means nourishment. So if we think what's nourishment that we're talking about, a nourishment structure would be a pattern of feeding relationships consisting of different levels. Trophic structures are just going to give us the food chain. Okay, so this is where we already know the food chain. We know how this stuff operates. In fact, I think I heard on quite a few presentations, I was hearing like secondary and primary consumers and stuff like that. So I'm really hearing that we already have some of this, but we need the terminology to it. So trophic structure is probably the best term to utilize, but it is going to be our food chain, aka food chain. So this transfer of food moves chemical nutrients and energy from producers up through the trophic levels in a community. All right. So producers are the autotrophs, are self-nourishers that support all the other trophic levels. Consumers are heterotrophs that get different nourishments. So herbivores, those that eat the producers, are primary consumers. Secondary consumers on land typically eat the herbivores. In aquatic, it's typically eat zooplankton because it'd be phytoplankton is actually the primary. Well, no, it's the producer. My bad. Tertiary consumers typically eat then the secondary consumers, and our quaternary consumers typically eat the tertiary consumers. So we heard a lot of the secondary consumers, but we didn't get up to the tertiary and quaternary levels, which definitely exist there. And we can look at an example. For example, we've got the terrestrial, we have a plant. The grasshopper eats the plant as the primary consumer. The mouse eats the grasshopper, he's the secondary consumer. The snake then eats the mouse as a tertiary consumer, and the hawk eats the snake as a quaternary consumer. Okay. And that also is, if we want to go with it, that's also a good example of predation. So is this one, that's herbivory. There you go. On the flip side, if we go into an aquatic environment, we've got phytoplankton. Remember, phyto means plant, so those are plant plankton. Fun facts. Then we have zooplankton, so that's animal plankton that eats the phytoplankton as primary consumers. Herring will eat the zooplankton as a secondary consumer. Tuna will eat the herring as a tertiary consumer, and the killer whale, don't care, will eat the tuna and be a quaternary consumer. Now with this, we've got a couple of extras, like detritivores. I heard that one come up quite a bit as well, so this should be a good review. They derive their energy from detritus, which is dead material produced at all the trophic levels. So detritivores are things that are going to eat the dead and decaying materials. So even most cockroaches are detritivores. They live out in the forest. They eat dead and decaying leaf litter. They actually have to eat that stuff. There would also be vultures are kind of more scavengers, but they could cover under the detritivores because they're eating that dead material. So kind of a vulture thing would be as well. Decomposers, though, are going to be different because these guys are mainly prokaryotes and fungi, and they secrete enzymes that digest molecules or organic materials and convert them into inorganic forms in a process called decomposition. So they're just kind of breaking down materials and organic materials and digesting them sort of outside. So detritivores eat the dead stuff, and decomposers actually help with the decomposition process. Okay. A more realistic view, though, because we have a nice food chain, which is lovely, but that's not necessarily realistic. So what's more realistic is called the food web, and it's a network of all kinds of interconnecting food chains. So consumer may eat more than one type of producer, and several species of primary consumers may feed on the same species of producer. Some animals weave into the web at more than one trophic level, so it gets to be more complex than that, as it should be. So if we've got all these guys here, if we're in a desert, we've got all of our producers. That one's fairly easy to figure out, and not a lot of variability on that one. All these guys could be potential primary consumers. If you notice, we've got a woodpecker, we've got this little antelope, squirrel, kangaroo rat, grasshopper mouse, because it still actually eats some plants as well. Harvester ants maybe are eating some of this stuff. So here, all of these are representing primary consumers. However, when you start adding on to the next level, then they become secondary consumers, things that are also eating. If you notice, the grasshopper mouse has both colors because it can be a primary consumer and a secondary. So it's got the omnivore situation going on. So it goes with the kind of Gila woodpecker over there. It's serving both functions. It'll eat the ants, but it'll also eat stuff from the cacti. All right, and then we could, I think that's where that one kind of stays. Oh, no, we do have up to tertiary and quaternary. So we have a tertiary, that's where our kind of purple ones are coming into effect, and then we get even to quaternary. So this guy over here, this red-tailed hawk, can be a secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumer. So it doesn't really matter, it eats meats of all kinds, but it'll eat all of them. It'll eat this squirrel, it'll eat that squirrel, it'll eat that snake, it don't care. So it actually covers most of the consumer categories, except for primary consumers, not really into eating the veggies. Okay, so some interesting stuff. Other parts, the species diversity is defined by two components, species richness. By the way, this is a new section, so it's again another good place to take a break if you need to take one. This is a good place to pause the video, stretch, write some questions, start out with your summary a bit, and then come back if you need to. So species diversity has two components. Species richness, which is the number of species in a community. So number of species, richness, number of species. And then relative abundance, so the proportional representation of a species in the community. So sort of it's like fraction of we'll say of species. What do we mean by that? Okay, so if we look at a couple of different things, we might say this. Does this give us the representation? We've got two different things, and they actually have the same species richness. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different types of plants. Okay, and here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got, again, 4 types of plants. So we have both species have the same richness, but if you look, this sort of, I'll call it like an oak tree, has a higher percentage. So what we'd call that is relative abundance. So this guy has a higher relative abundance. Like there are way more of these things than there are the other guys. Same species richness, but more relative abundance of like the little oak tree. And this one, maybe they have all about equal relative abundance. So nobody is outweighing anybody in those pictures. So that tells us a lot about species diversity. Okay, so if we look at the species again, in wood plot A, we had 80%, and then 10 and 5 and 5 for this one. In B, we had 25 all across the board. So the relative abundance of these tree species are different. And so it means that they're going to have a different set of animals that are there, different set of plants going on. It changes the dynamics quite a bit. All right. We're going to take a look at some patterns, by the way, now. So this gives me an idea we're looking at patterns, but oh, I forgot what this has done. Oh, food web complexity and species diversity. So actually, this one's talking about if we had something to control it and without controlling it. So we do need some diversity that actually helps to keep some in check. So when we have something, we're able to control it, and when we don't have it, we'll lose a whole lot of species diversity. Forgot what that was getting to. So in the absence of disaster, the species richness dropped from more than 15 species to fewer than 5. So what caused the dramatic change? So this is thinking through species richness, all that stuff that we just talked about, how many different types of species there are. So what accounted for the dramatic change? So a mussel of the genus Mytilus proved to be superior competitor for the available space, eliminating most of the invertebrates and algae. In the control areas, populations of the Mytilus was suppressed by Pisaster, a voracious predator of the mussel. So thus, interspecific interactions can be an important factor in species diversity in a community. So which ones we have available can actually affect the species diversity. So without having this guy, species diversity changed rapidly and went down, in fact. I knew there was a reason I was talking about that. So here's this guy, by the way, for those of you guys with echinoderms, showing off here is a little bit of, you can see this guy, it is eating the crap out of this mussel in here. So they are voracious predators, even though they're slow. Like they make sloths look fast, is how slow they are. Okay, here's another part about keystone species. So Payne's experiments and others gave rise to what's called a keystone species, one whose impact on the community is larger than its biomass or abundance indicates. It occupies a niche that holds the rest of the community in place. So in that last example, the Pisaster was definitely an example, as when you lost it, all the other species just went to hell. So that matters, as although there's just a few of them, it's a keystone species who has a huge impact on that community. All right, so you think of like a keystone and an arch, the whole point is that it's put there, and then if you remove it, everything else collapses. That's the idea of the keystone species. You remove the Pisaster starfish, and all kind of collapsed. Okay, disturbances. We're going to move kind of quickly and see how far we can get before we get to the 30-minute mark here on this one. You guys get mad at me. But disturbances are important. These are events that damage biological communities. They include storms, fires, floods, drought, and human activity. We know disturbances well from this year. We can think of examples. So the types of disturbances and their frequency and severity vary from community to community. Okay. Small-scale disturbances may have positive effects, and often do. However, communities change drastically following a severe disturbance that strips away vegetation and removes significant amounts of soil. So even the flooding that we experienced with Harvey did a huge number on it. And then when the resulting kind of afterwards, we had a lot of freezes that happened this year. I know if you look around your population, like look around your community or come to someone else's, and you can see, especially like sago palms and things, which nobody likes anyway. They're beautiful, and then they tend to grow too much. But a lot of those have died out well, and so that's because of different disturbances. We experienced a lot of climatic changes over the last, 7 months? So there's been a lot of disturbance even in our ornamentals. Something to think about. So disturbance area, and this will be the last thing if I remember correctly, but let me get through this one because this is a good one. So the disturbed area may be colonized by a variety of species, which are gradually replaced by a succession of other species. We call that ecological succession. So it's who comes next. Okay, so primary succession begins when there's a virtually lifeless area with no soil. Examples would be areas where rubble is left by a retreating glacier, or where we get fresh volcanic lava flows. So this is essentially brand new soil, brand new habitat or environment. It's brand new. That's primary succession. So here's lava flows and we get these little plants coming out of it. That's primary succession because it's brand new land. Secondary succession, however, is most of the time it's when a disturbance destroys an existing community but leaves the soil intact. So whenever human intervention stops, secondary succession begins. Numerous studies have documented the stages by which an abandoned farm results to a forest. So what happens is first you get these little annual plants, you get the little shrubbery things, then you get perennial plants and grasses that will come in, shrubs, and then it moves to softwood trees, so like pine trees and stuff like that, and then eventually moves to sort of hardwood trees like oaks and stuff. Okay, so that's how that moves. That's the general succession and how it operates. We could talk about invasive species. These are organisms that have introduced into non-native habitat by human actions. They've established themselves in the expense of the native communities. We can talk about this one a little bit later, but what's funny about these is the same plants for agriculture stuff, the ones we want for agriculture, we can also, it's the same things that we like, but invasive species are just ones that humans don't like. Okay. So they usually have the absence of natural enemies that allows rapid population growth of the invasive species. Again, we love those things for like corn and other stuff that we want for agricultural purposes, but when we don't want it, then we don't like it, we're not using it, then it's an invasive species. Okay. So examples of invasive species that deliberate introduction is like rabbits into Australia and the cane toads into Australia. So those are ones we can look at a little bit later, but you can see kind of the frontier of the rabbit spread that from 1860 all the way to 1980, that guy was moving, and there are a lot of them. A lot. Okay, and if you want to see the cane toad, that's the cane toad. All right, I know I went a little long on that one, but that introduces you guys to all the stuff that you'll need to know for community stuff. So if you have any questions, shoot me an email, and we'll keep moving forward.